Captain Marcus Williams stood at his bedroom window, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the royal palace grounds. After 15 years of loyal service to the crown, he had earned the respect of every soldier under his command. His men trusted him completely, but lately, disturbing reports had been reaching his desk about the royal guard's behavior. The complaints came from palace staff, visiting dignitaries, and even some of the younger guards themselves. Stories of excessive force during routine security checks, harassment of kitchen workers, and a growing sense of entitlement among certain members of the elite Royal Guard unit. These weren't the values Marcus had instilled during his years of leadership. As the head of palace security, Marcus felt personally responsible for every person who wore the royal uniform. The Royal Guard was supposed to represent the finest qualities of service and honor. Instead, whispers in the corridors spoke of guards who believed their position made them untouchable, who treated others with contempt rather than the dignity every person deserved. Marcus had tried addressing these issues through official channels. He'd held meetings, issued new guidelines, and even personally spoken with several guards. But the problems persisted, and he suspected that his presence as their commanding officer was preventing him from seeing the full extent of their misconduct. People were afraid to speak honestly when he was around, knowing that complaints might somehow make their way back to the guards themselves. The breaking point came when Sarah, a young kitchen maid, approached him with tears in her eyes. She'd been working late in the palace kitchens when 2 royal guards had cornered her, making inappropriate comments and refusing to let her leave until she'd answered their personal questions. When she'd tried to report the incident through proper channels, she was told that her word against 2 decorated guards wouldn't hold much weight. That night, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He would need to see the truth for himself, but not as their commanding officer. He would need to become someone else entirely, someone who could witness their true behavior without the filter of rank and authority. The plan forming in his mind was risky and unconventional, but it might be the only way to protect the innocent people working in the palace and restore honor to the royal guard. Marcus began studying the palace's daily routines with new eyes. He observed how staff members moved through the building when they worked, where they gathered, and how they interacted with the guards. He noticed the subtle signs of fear and discomfort that he'd previously missed, the way conversations stopped when certain guards approached, and how some staff members took longer routes to avoid particular areas. The next morning, Marcus submitted a formal request for a week of personal leave, citing family matters that required his immediate attention. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Thompson, would oversee operations in his absence. As far as anyone knew, Captain Williams would be visiting his elderly aunt in the countryside, completely unreachable except for true emergencies. But Marcus wouldn't be leaving the palace at all. Instead, he would be hiding in plain sight, taking on a role that would allow him to observe his guards' true character when they believed no one important was watching. He'd already made contact with the palace's head of maintenance, explaining his plan and securing the necessary cooperation. Tomorrow, Marcus Williams would disappear, and in his place would appear David Miller, a new maintenance worker starting his first week on the job. The transformation wouldn't be easy. Marcus would need to completely change his appearance, his posture, his way of speaking, and even his confidence level. He practiced walking with the slightly hunched shoulders of someone accustomed to being overlooked, speaking in the quiet tones of a person who'd learned to stay invisible. He studied the work schedules, the cleaning protocols, and the countless small details that would make his disguise believable. As he prepared for what lay ahead, Marcus felt a mixture of determination and sadness. Part of him hoped his suspicions were wrong, that the reports had been exaggerated or misunderstood. But deep in his heart, he knew that something had gone seriously wrong with the unit he'd spent years building. The only question now was just how far some of his guards had fallen from the standards they'd sworn to uphold. Monday morning arrived with the kind of nervous energy that comes before stepping into the unknown. Marcus had spent the weekend perfecting his disguise, and now David Miller stood where Captain Williams once had. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the straight-backed military posture, replaced by the slightly stooped shoulders of a working man. His usually immaculate uniform had been exchanged for worn work clothes, and careful makeup had added years to his face and dulled his sharp features. The head of maintenance, George Patterson, had been briefed on the situation and was the only person who knew David Miller's true identity. He'd agreed to help after hearing about the staff's complaints, particularly since several of his own workers had mentioned uncomfortable encounters with certain guards. George introduced David to the rest of the maintenance crew as a new hire, who'd recently moved to the area looking for steady work. David's first assignment was cleaning the main corridor on the second floor, an area frequented by both staff and guards throughout the day. As he mopped the marble floors with careful, methodical strokes, he kept his eyes down, but his ears open. The work itself was harder than he'd expected. His hands, accustomed to holding weapons and signing documents, weren't used to gripping a mop handle for hours at a time. The first few hours passed quietly. Staff members walked by with barely a glance, treating him with the same polite indifference they showed all maintenance workers. But when the guards began their morning patrols, David immediately noticed the difference in atmosphere. Conversations became more subdued, people walked a little faster, and there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Sergeant Collins was the first guard to really interact with David. Collins had been with the Royal Guard for 8 years and had always presented himself as professional and courteous in Marcus's presence. But now, speaking to someone he saw as just a janitor, a different side emerged. "Hey, you," Collins called out sharply, making David look up from his work. "You missed a spot over there." He pointed to an area that David had already cleaned thoroughly. When David politely acknowledged the comment and moved to clean the area again, Collins smirked and walked away without another word. It was a small thing, but it revealed an attitude that Marcus had never witnessed before. As the day progressed, David began to see patterns that troubled him deeply. Guards would walk through freshly mopped areas without any consideration, forcing him to clean the same spots multiple times. They spoke about staff members in crude terms when they thought only a lowly maintenance worker could hear them. Most disturbing was how they discussed their authority, making comments about how nobody would dare question them or challenge their decisions. During his lunch break, David sat in the staff cafeteria with other maintenance workers and kitchen staff. Here, away from the guards' watchful eyes, people spoke more freely. He heard stories that made his blood run cold. Maria, one of the housekeepers, quietly mentioned how guard Stevens had been following her around during her shifts, making personal comments about her appearance and asking intrusive questions about her personal life. Tom, a young man who worked in the gardens, shared how 2 guards had accused him of stealing, simply because he'd been carrying tools near an area where something had gone missing. They'd searched his belongings roughly and made threats about what would happen if they ever had reason to suspect him again. The missing item was later found exactly where it was supposed to be, but no apology was ever offered. David listened to these stories with growing anger and disappointment. These weren't isolated incidents or misunderstandings. They were part of a pattern of behavior that showed some of his guards had begun to see themselves as rulers rather than protectors. They were using their positions to intimidate and harass people who had no power to fight back. The afternoon brought even more disturbing revelations. While cleaning near the guards' break room, David overheard a conversation that chilled him to the bone. Guards Peterson and Miller were discussing Sarah, the kitchen maid who had come to Marcus with her complaint. They were laughing about how scared she'd looked and making crude jokes about her reaction to their attention. Peterson even boasted about how easy it was to intimidate staff members, saying that they could do whatever they wanted because who would believe a servant's word against a royal guard's? As David continued his work, moving through different areas of the palace, he began to understand the full scope of the problem. It wasn't just a few bad guards, it was a culture that had developed among certain members of the unit. They'd created an environment where abuse of power was normalized, where intimidation was seen as amusing, and where the very people they were supposed to protect had become targets for their entertainment. By the end of his first day as David Miller, Marcus felt sick to his stomach. The unit he'd spent years building and leading had become something he barely recognized, but he also knew that one day wasn't enough to fully understand the situation. He needed to see more, to document everything and to gather enough evidence to take decisive action. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and he suspected that what he'd witnessed so far was only the beginning. Tuesday brought new assignments and deeper insights into the toxic culture that had infected parts of the Royal Guard. David was tasked with cleaning the administrative offices, which meant spending time near the guards' duty stations and overhearing more of their unguarded conversations. What he discovered made him realize that the problem was far worse than he'd initially suspected. The morning started with an incident that would stay with Marcus for the rest of his life. While cleaning the windows in the main administrative hallway, he witnessed guard Harrison deliberately trip an elderly staff member named Robert, who was carrying a stack of documents. The papers scattered across the floor, and Robert, embarrassed and confused, immediately began apologizing and scrambling to collect them. Instead of helping or acknowledging his role in the accident, Harrison stood over the old man with obvious amusement. He made comments about how clumsy some people were and suggested that maybe Robert was getting too old for his job. Other guards who witnessed the incident laughed along, treating the old man's distress as entertainment. David wanted desperately to intervene, but he knew that breaking character would compromise his mission and potentially allow the real perpetrators to escape justice. As Robert struggled to gather the scattered papers, his hands shaking with a combination of age and humiliation, David quietly moved closer and began helping him collect the documents. The grateful look in the elderly man's eyes was heartbreaking, especially knowing that this kind of treatment was happening regularly throughout the palace. Later that morning, David overheard a conversation that revealed the guards had developed their own informal ranking system based on who could get away with the most outrageous behavior. They were essentially competing to see who could push boundaries furthest without facing consequences. Guard Stevens bragged about making kitchen staff work extra hours by repeatedly rejecting their cleaning efforts, claiming areas weren't clean enough when they clearly were. Guard Peterson boasted about conducting unnecessary searches of staff lockers, enjoying the power to invade people's privacy on a whim. The most disturbing revelation came during lunch, when David was cleaning near a conference room where several guards had gathered. Through the partially open door, he heard them discussing what they called the game. This involved deliberately creating situations where staff members would be forced to interact with them, then using those interactions to make people uncomfortable or afraid. They talked about it like a sport, keeping informal scores and sharing techniques for maximum psychological impact. One guard mentioned how he'd been systematically targeting Julia, a young woman who worked in the palace library. He'd been finding excuses to visit the library multiple times each day, asking unnecessary questions and making personal comments that clearly made her uncomfortable. When she'd tried to avoid him by working in different sections, he'd made it his mission to seek her out, treating her obvious distress as a challenge to overcome. David's hands clenched around his cleaning supplies as he listened to these casual discussions of psychological harassment. These weren't soldiers maintaining security. They were predators using their authority to torment innocent people. The worst part was how normalized it had become among certain members of the unit. They genuinely seemed to believe that their positions gave them the right to treat others as sources of entertainment. The afternoon brought an incident that nearly broke David's cover entirely. While cleaning the stairwell leading to the upper floors, he witnessed Guard Martinez corner a teenage kitchen assistant named Emma. The girl was clearly terrified, pressed against the wall as Martinez stood uncomfortably close, asking intrusive questions about her family and where she lived. When she tried to leave, he blocked her path, claiming he wasn't finished talking to her yet. Every instinct Marcus had developed over 15 years of military service screamed at him to intervene immediately. This wasn't just harassment, it was beginning to look like something much more serious. The girl's obvious fear and Martinez's aggressive body language created a situation that could escalate dangerously at any moment. David made a split-second decision that he hoped wouldn't blow his cover. He deliberately dropped his bucket of cleaning supplies, creating a loud crash that echoed through the stairwell. The sudden noise startled both Martinez and Emma, breaking the tension of the moment. Martinez spun around angrily, demanding to know what the clumsy janitor was doing. David played his role perfectly, apologizing profusely and scrambling to clean up the spilled water, while acting completely oblivious to what had been happening. The interruption gave Emma the chance she needed to escape, and she quickly disappeared up the stairs. Martinez was clearly frustrated that his intimidation session had been interrupted, but he couldn't exactly explain why without admitting to what he'd been doing. As Martinez stormed off, David caught a glimpse of Emma looking back from the top of the stairs. The relief in her young face was unmistakable, and though she didn't know who had really helped her, David felt a small measure of satisfaction that he'd been able to protect at least one person that day. The rest of the afternoon was spent documenting everything he'd witnessed. Mentally cataloging names, incidents, and patterns of behavior, David was building a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond individual bad actors. This was an organized culture of harassment and intimidation that had been allowed to flourish in the shadows, protected by the very authority that was supposed to serve others. As the day ended and David prepared to return to his quarters, he knew that tomorrow would bring even more difficult revelations. But he also knew that every hour spent in disguise brought him closer to having the evidence needed to clean house and restore honor to the royal guard. The question was whether he could maintain his cover long enough to see the full scope of the problem, and whether his heart could bear witnessing much more of what his trusted guards had become. Wednesday morning arrived with dark clouds gathering over the palace, matching the growing storm in Marcus's heart as he prepared for another day as David Miller. The previous 2 days had shown him behaviors that challenged everything he thought he knew about the men under his command. But nothing could have prepared him for what he would witness on this day. David's assignment took him to the lower levels of the palace, where staff quarters and storage areas were located. This was a part of the building that senior officers rarely visited, which meant the guards operating here felt even more free to act without oversight. As he began his cleaning duties in the narrow corridors, David immediately sensed that something was different about this area. The staff members he encountered seemed more nervous than those working in the main palace areas. They moved quickly, kept their heads down, and spoke in whispers when they spoke at all. Several times David noticed people glance anxiously down corridors before moving, as if checking to make sure certain guards weren't approaching. The reason for this atmosphere became clear around mid-morning, when David witnessed what could only be described as a systematic shakedown operation. Guards Wilson and Clark were conducting what they called routine security inspections of staff lockers, but their true purpose was immediately obvious. They weren't looking for security threats. They were looking for anything of value they could confiscate under the pretense of violations. David watched in horror as the 2 guards rifled through the personal belongings of kitchen staff, pocketing small items like jewelry, pocket watches, and even family photographs that had sentimental value. When they found a few coins in one locker, they claimed it was suspicious for a kitchen worker to have so much money, and confiscated it as evidence of potential theft. The staff member, a middle-aged woman named Agnes, could only stand by helplessly as her week's wages disappeared into Wilson's pocket. The guards had clearly done this before. They moved with practiced efficiency, knowing exactly how to word their accusations to make everything sound official and legitimate. They spoke about security protocols and suspicious behavior, using official language to disguise what was essentially organized theft. Agnes and the other staff members had no choice but to accept their explanations, knowing that challenging 2 armed guards would only make their situations worse. But the financial exploitation was just the beginning of what David discovered in the lower levels. As he continued his cleaning duties, moving through areas where the guards thought no one important could see them, he witnessed scenes that made him question how he could have been so blind to what was happening under his own command. In a storage room that was supposed to be used for palace supplies, David found evidence of an illegal gambling operation being run by several guards. They were using their duty time to play cards and dice games, betting money that David suspected had been stolen from staff members during their security inspections. The room reeked of alcohol, and empty bottles hidden behind legitimate supplies showed that drinking on duty had become commonplace among this group. When David accidentally made noise while cleaning nearby, the guards quickly hid their game and emerged from the storage room acting as if they'd been conducting official business. The speed with which they could transform from criminals back to professional guards showed just how long this had been going on and how sophisticated their deception had become. The most devastating discovery came in the afternoon when David was assigned to clean near the guards' break area in the basement level. Through a partially open door, he overheard a conversation that revealed the true extent of the corruption that had infected his unit. Guards Peterson, Harrison, and Stevens were discussing what they called the arrangement. They had developed a system where staff members could pay them small amounts of money in exchange for being left alone. Kitchen workers, housekeepers, and maintenance staff were essentially being forced to pay protection money to avoid harassment, false accusations, and planted evidence that could cost them their jobs. David listened in growing rage as they discussed their victims like a business portfolio. They talked about which staff members had family members they needed to support, making them more likely to pay rather than risk losing their positions. They laughed about how desperate some people were to keep their jobs, treating human suffering as a source of both profit and amusement. Peterson bragged about how he'd convinced a young housekeeper to give him half her wages each week by threatening to plant stolen items in her cleaning cart. Harrison described how he'd been systematically intimidating an elderly groundskeeper, making him pay to avoid being reported for imaginary infractions. Stevens boasted about the crying kitchen maid who'd begged him not to report her for a violation she'd never committed, offering her jewelry as payment for his silence. The casual cruelty in their voices was almost unbearable to hear. These men had taken the oath to protect and serve, and instead they had become exactly the kind of predators that the Royal Guard existed to stop. They were using their authority, their weapons, and their positions of trust to systematically exploit the most vulnerable people in the palace. As David continued cleaning, his hands shaking with suppressed rage, he overheard them planning their next targets. They discussed staff members like hunters discussing prey, analyzing weaknesses and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. They talked about new arrivals who didn't yet understand how things worked and would need to be taught their place in the unofficial hierarchy that the corrupt guards had created. Bingtai's conversation revealed that this wasn't just happening in the lower levels of the palace. The guards described similar operations throughout the building, coordinated efforts to identify and exploit anyone who couldn't fight back. They had turned the Royal Guard into an organized crime syndicate, using their legitimate authority as cover for systematic abuse and theft. By the end of the day, David felt physically sick from what he'd witnessed. The scope of the corruption was staggering, involving not just individual misconduct but an entire shadow system of exploitation and abuse. Staff members weren't just dealing with occasional harassment. They were living under a reign of terror created by the very people who were supposed to protect them. As he prepared to leave his shift, David knew that he had enough evidence to take action, but he also knew that tomorrow would bring the most dangerous part of his investigation. He needed to understand how high this corruption went, and whether any of his trusted senior officers were involved. The answers to those questions would determine not just the fate of the corrupt guards, but the future of the entire Royal Guard unit that had been his life's work. Thursday arrived with an atmosphere of dread that seemed to permeate every corner of the palace. David Miller began his 4th day undercover knowing that he was approaching the most critical phase of his investigation. Today, he would need to get closer to the senior guards and determine how far up the chain of command this corruption extended. The thought that some of his most trusted officers might be involved made him feel physically ill. His assignment for the day took him to the upper administrative floors, where the senior guards had their offices and conducted their planning meetings. This was dangerous territory for his disguise, as these were areas where he'd spent countless hours as Captain Williams. Every step carried the risk that someone might recognize something familiar about the quiet maintenance worker moving through their midst. David's first shock came early in the morning when he discovered that Lieutenant Thompson, his own second-in-command, was not only aware of the corruption, but was actively coordinating it. While cleaning near Thompson's office, David overheard a meeting that revealed the true organizational structure of what had become a criminal enterprise operating within the Royal Guard. Thompson was meeting with the corrupt guards, reviewing what he called weekly reports that had nothing to do with security. Instead, they were discussing collection amounts from their protection racket, planning which staff members to target next, and coordinating their schedules to ensure maximum coverage for their illegal activities. Thompson spoke with the authority of someone who had been running this operation for months, possibly years. The betrayal cut deeper than Marcus had imagined possible. Thompson had been his right-hand man for over 5 years, someone he'd trusted completely, and had been grooming for eventual promotion to captain. They'd shared meals, discussed strategy, and worked together to build what Marcus thought was an exemplary unit. To discover that Thompson had been using that trust to build a criminal organization was devastating beyond words. As David continued his cleaning duties, moving carefully through areas where he might be recognized, he began to understand the sophisticated nature of the operation Thompson had created. The corrupt guards weren't just random bad actors. They were part of a carefully organized system with clear hierarchies, assigned territories, and regular reporting structures. Thompson had essentially created a mafia within the Royal Guard, using military discipline and organization to maximize their criminal profits. The scope of their activities was staggering. Beyond the protection racket targeting palace staff, they were involved in theft of palace supplies, skimming money from security budgets, and even selling information about palace schedules and security procedures to outside parties. What had started as individual guards abusing their authority had evolved into systematic corruption that threatened the security of the entire royal family. David's most harrowing discovery came when he found evidence that the corrupt guards were keeping detailed files on palace staff members, hidden in Thompson's office, which David accessed during the lunch break when everyone was away, were folders containing personal information about staff members' families, financial situations, and vulnerabilities. This wasn't random harassment. It was targeted exploitation based on careful intelligence gathering. The files revealed the calculated cruelty behind their operations. They knew which staff members had sick children who needed medical care, which ones were supporting elderly parents, and which ones had debts or other financial pressures that made them particularly vulnerable to extortion. The guards were using this information to apply maximum pressure, ensuring compliance with their demands for payment and silence. One file that particularly broke David's heart belonged to Sarah, the kitchen maid who had originally come to Captain Williams for help. The note showed that the guards had researched her background thoroughly, discovering that she was supporting a younger brother's education and couldn't afford to lose her job. They had calculated exactly how much pressure to apply and what threats would be most effective in keeping her silent about their harassment. But the most shocking revelation came in the afternoon when David discovered that the corruption extended beyond the royal guard itself. Hidden in another set of files were records of payments made to certain palace administrators and even some members of the household staff who had been recruited as informants. Thompson had built a network of corruption that reached into every level of palace operations. The informants provided information about staff schedules, personal problems, and potential targets for exploitation. They also served as early warning systems, alerting the corrupt guards when someone might be considering reporting their activities to higher authorities. This explained how the operation had managed to continue for so long without detection. They had eyes and ears throughout the palace feeding them information about potential threats to their activities. David realized that his own investigation might have been compromised if not for his decision to work undercover. Several of the people he would normally have turned to for help were listed in Thompson's files as either active participants or unwilling accomplices who had been intimidated into silence. The corruption had spread so far that the normal channels for reporting and addressing misconduct had been completely compromised. As the day wore on, David gathered more evidence of the systematic nature of the criminal organization operating under his nose. They had schedules for their various illegal activities, codes for communicating about their operations, and even contingency plans for what to do if they were discovered. Thompson had taken everything Marcus had taught him about military organization and applied it to running a criminal enterprise. The emotional toll of these discoveries was enormous. Marcus felt not just anger and disappointment, but a deep sense of personal failure. How had he missed so many warning signs? How had his most trusted officer been able to build such an extensive criminal operation right under his nose? The questions tormented him as he continued his careful documentation of everything he was discovering. But alongside the devastation came a growing determination to set things right. Every file he found, every conversation he overheard, and every piece of evidence he gathered brought him closer to having what he needed to destroy this corruption completely. Thompson and his associates had used the authority and trust that Marcus had given them to prey on innocent people, and now they would face the full consequences of their betrayal. By Thursday evening, David Miller had seen enough to understand that this wasn't a problem that could be solved with warnings or disciplinary action. The corruption was too deep, too organized, and too widespread for anything less than complete dismantlement. Tomorrow would bring the final phase of his investigation, and then Captain Marcus Williams would return to clean house in a way that none of the corrupt guards could have imagined possible. Friday morning brought with it the weight of accumulated evidence and the knowledge that this would be David Miller's final day in disguise. Marcus had spent the previous evening organizing everything he had discovered, preparing for what would be the most difficult confrontation of his military career. But before he could act as Captain Williams, he needed to gather one final piece of evidence that would make his case absolutely unshakable. David's assignment for the day was to clean the main conference room where Thompson was scheduled to hold what the corrupt guards called a strategy meeting. Marcus knew this was actually a planning session for their criminal activities, and he needed to witness it firsthand to understand the full scope of their organization and identify every participant. The meeting was scheduled for late morning, which gave David time to position himself in the adjoining storage room, where he could hear everything through the thin walls. As he quietly organized cleaning supplies and positioned himself near the shared wall, his heart pounded with anticipation and anger. This would be the moment when he finally saw the complete picture of what his trusted officers had become. When the meeting began, David was stunned by how many voices he recognized. Thompson was leading the discussion, but participants included not just the guards David had identified as corrupt, but several others he had considered among his most reliable officers. The betrayal was even more extensive than he had imagined. Involving nearly half of his senior guard, Unit Thompson opened the meeting by reviewing what he called their monthly performance metrics. David listened in horror as his second-in-command discussed their extortion income, theft profits, and expansion plans with the same professional tone he had once used for legitimate security briefings. The corruption had become so normalized among this group that they were treating it like any other administrative function. The guards reported on their various territories within the palace, discussing which staff members were proving most profitable and which ones might need additional pressure to ensure compliance. They talked about people David had known for years, dedicated employees who had served the royal family faithfully, as if they were nothing more than sources of income to be exploited. But the most chilling part of the meeting came when Thompson discussed their plans for dealing with potential threats to their operation. They had identified several staff members who seemed to be getting suspicious about the guards' activities, and Thompson was assigning specific guards to handle these situations through increased intimidation and false accusations. David's blood ran cold when he heard his own name mentioned. Thompson revealed that Captain Williams had been asking too many questions about staff complaints and guard behavior. They were developing a plan to discredit him by planting evidence of misconduct in his office and creating false testimony from carefully selected witnesses. The level of calculated betrayal was breathtaking. Thompson explained how they would wait for Captain Williams to return from his leave, then spring their trap by having multiple guards simultaneously report concerns about his behavior. They would claim he had been inappropriate with staff members, had been drinking on duty, and had been misusing his authority for personal gain. The irony of these criminals accusing an honest officer of their own crimes would have been laughable if it hadn't been so genuinely threatening. As David listened to them plan his downfall, he realized how close he had come to walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. If he had returned to duty without conducting this undercover investigation, he would have found himself facing charges and accusations that could have ended his career and destroyed his reputation. The corrupt guards weren't just stealing and extorting. They were prepared to destroy anyone who threatened their operation. The meeting continued with discussions of expanding their activities beyond the palace walls. Thompson revealed contacts with criminal organizations in the city who were interested in purchasing palace security information and gaining access to areas that were supposed to be restricted. The guards weren't just betraying their oaths to protect the royal family. They were actively working with outside criminals who might pose genuine security threats. David carefully memorized every name mentioned, every plan discussed, and every detail that would be needed to build an airtight case against all participants. The evidence was overwhelming, but he knew that the scope of the corruption meant he would need help from outside authorities to ensure that justice was properly served. As the meeting concluded, Thompson gave final instructions about maintaining secrecy and reminded everyone about the severe consequences of betraying the group. The threat was clear. Anyone who tried to expose their activities would face retaliation that could extend beyond their professional lives to their families and personal safety. David remained hidden in the storage room until all the participants had left, then spent the rest of the day documenting his final observations and preparing for what would come next. He had seen enough corruption to last several lifetimes, But he had also gathered enough evidence to ensure that every guilty party would face appropriate consequences. That evening, as David Miller completed his final shift, Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions. The past week had been the most difficult of his professional life, revealing betrayals that challenged everything he believed about loyalty, honor, and leadership. But it had also confirmed his commitment to protecting innocent people and upholding the values that the Royal Guard was supposed to represent. The investigation phase was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Tomorrow, Captain Marcus Williams would return from his leave with evidence that would shock the entire palace hierarchy. The corrupt guards had spent months building their criminal empire, confident that their authority made them untouchable. They were about to discover just how wrong they had been. As David packed away his cleaning supplies for the last time, Marcus began mentally preparing for the confrontation that would restore honor to the Royal Guard and justice for all the innocent people who had suffered under the corrupt guard's reign of terror. The reckoning was coming, and it would be more thorough and devastating than any of the criminals could have imagined. Monday morning arrived like the dawn of a new era. Captain Marcus Williams strode through the palace gates with the confident bearing of a man who had spent a week visiting family in the countryside. But behind his calm exterior lay the focused determination of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. The evidence he carried would change everything, and the corrupt guards who thought they ruled these halls were about to face a reckoning beyond their worst nightmares. Marcus had spent the weekend carefully preparing his strategy. The corruption was too extensive and too well organized to handle through normal military discipline. He had contacted the Royal Prosecutor's Office, the Palace Security Oversight Committee, and even representatives from the royal family itself. Today would not just be about firing bad guards. It would be about dismantling a criminal organization and restoring faith in an institution that had been betrayed from within. His first stop was Lieutenant Thompson's office. Thompson greeted him with the same professional smile he had always shown, asking about his leave and expressing gratitude that Marcus was back to handle the important decisions. The performance was flawless, giving no indication that Thompson was already planning to destroy Marcus's career and reputation. Marcus allowed the conversation to continue normally for several minutes, carefully observing Thompson's demeanor and giving him every opportunity to come forward voluntarily with information about problems that might have occurred during his absence. Thompson mentioned nothing unusual, reporting that everything had been running smoothly and that the guards had maintained their high standards of professionalism and service. When Marcus finally revealed what he had discovered, the change in Thompson's expression was immediate and devastating. The confident smile disappeared, replaced by a look of shock that quickly transformed into panic and then desperate calculation. Thompson's first instinct was to deny everything, claiming that Marcus must have been misinformed or that someone was trying to frame loyal guards with false accusations. But Marcus had prepared for this moment carefully. He began laying out evidence with methodical precision, describing conversations he had overheard, documents he had photographed, and incidents he had witnessed firsthand. With each revelation, Thompson's denials became weaker and more desperate, until finally he fell silent, realizing that his carefully constructed criminal empire was crumbling around him. The confrontation with Thompson was just the beginning. Marcus had coordinated with external authorities to ensure that all the corrupt guards could be arrested simultaneously, preventing any of them from destroying evidence or fleeing. Throughout the morning, investigators moved through the palace with warrants, arresting guards who had spent months believing themselves untouchable. The scene in the main corridor was unlike anything the palace had ever witnessed. Guards who had strutted with arrogant authority just hours before were led away in handcuffs, their faces showing disbelief that their criminal activities had finally been exposed. Some tried to maintain their innocence, while others attempted to negotiate by offering information about their accomplices. But the most powerful moment came when Marcus addressed the entire palace staff in the main assembly hall. Word of the arrests had spread quickly, and every employee who had suffered under the corrupt guards' intimidation was present to witness their vindication. Marcus stood before the crowd, still feeling the emotional weight of everything he had witnessed during his week undercover. He began by apologizing personally to every staff member who had been victimized by guards under his command. The responsibility for their suffering lay with him as their commanding officer. and he would carry that burden for the rest of his career. But he also wanted them to know that justice would be served completely and that the Royal Guard would be rebuilt to reflect the values it was supposed to represent. As Marcus spoke, he could see tears in the eyes of staff members who had lived in fear for so long. Sarah, the kitchen maid who had first brought her concerns to him, was openly crying with relief. Agnes, whose wages had been stolen during fake security inspections, was holding hands with other kitchen workers who had shared similar experiences. The elderly groundskeeper who had been forced to pay protection money was standing straighter than he had in months. Marcus then revealed something that stunned everyone present. He explained how he had spent the previous week working among them as David Miller, witnessing firsthand the courage and dignity they had shown, despite the harassment and intimidation they had faced. The revelation that their commanding officer had disguised himself as a maintenance worker to investigate corruption sent a ripple of amazement through the crowd. The emotional climax came when Marcus called several staff members forward publicly, recognizing their bravery in continuing to serve with honor, despite the threats they had faced. He presented commendations to those who had tried to report misconduct despite the risks, and he promised that new systems would be established to ensure that such corruption could never take root again. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and comprehensive. The evidence Marcus had gathered during his undercover investigation was overwhelming, leading to convictions on charges ranging from extortion and theft to conspiracy and abuse of authority. Thompson received the harshest sentence, reflecting his role as the criminal organization's leader and his betrayal of the trust Marcus had placed in him. But the real transformation was in the atmosphere of the palace itself. The fear that had hung over the staff areas like a dark cloud was lifted, replaced by a sense of security and dignity that many employees hadn't felt in years. New guards were recruited and trained with an emphasis on character and service that went far beyond military competence. Marcus implemented new oversight systems, regular meetings with staff representatives, and clear channels for reporting any concerns about guard behavior. Most importantly, he established a culture where protecting the innocent was seen as the highest duty of every guard, not just a job requirement but a moral imperative that defined their identity. Years later, staff members would still talk about the week when their commanding officer became one of them, risking his own position to expose the truth and restore justice. The story became legendary within the palace, a reminder that true leadership sometimes requires extraordinary courage, and that the greatest honor comes from serving those who depend on your protection. Marcus never regretted his decision to go undercover, despite the emotional toll of discovering how badly he had misjudged some of his officers. The week as David Miller had taught him lessons about leadership, justice, and human dignity that no military academy could have provided. Most importantly, it had restored his faith in the fundamental mission of the Royal Guard and his commitment to ensuring that such betrayal could never happen again.